old man under the tree and the secret that stunned a town. The river flowed slow and silver through Willow Creek, cutting a lazy path past clapboard houses and sleepy storefronts. It was the kind of town where time seemed to hang in the air, where folks waved from porches and knew the creak of every neighbor's screen door. In the heart of it all stood the town square, a patch of green framed by cobblestone paths and dominated by an ancient oak tree. Its branches sprawled wide, gnarled and heavy with history, casting a dappled shade that drew picnickers on Sundays and gossipers on weekdays. But for all its charm, the square had a shadow nobody liked to talk about: the old man under the tree. His name was Tom, Thomas J. Carter, though hardly anyone bothered with the full title. At 75, he was a weathered relic, his white hair tangled like a bird's nest after a storm, his clothes a patchwork of faded denim and threadbare flannel that hung off his bony frame. Every day, he'd shuffle to his spot beneath the oak, settling against its trunk with a sigh that sounded like it carried the weight of a lifetime. He'd mutter to himself, his voice a low rasp that blended with the rustle of leaves, and sometimes he'd stretch out a trembling hand to passers-by, asking for a scrap of food or a sip of water in a tone so soft it was almost lost in the breeze. Most folks pretended he wasn't there. Kids snickered and dared each other to lob pebbles at his feet, scattering when he'd blink at them with those cloudy, sunken eyes. Their parents were worse, hurrying past with tight lips and sidelong glances, muttering about crazy old Tom under their breath. Probably drunk again, they'd say, noses wrinkled like he carried a stench they couldn't bear. The oak was Willow Creek's pride, a living monument to the town's roots. But Tom, he was a blemish, a smudge on the picture-perfect image they wanted to project. Lynn Harper saw him differently. She was 22, a barista at Brew and Bean, the little coffee shop across the square with its chipped red awning and mismatched tables. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a messy bun, strands slipping loose by midday, and she had a smile that could thaw the iciest morning. She wasn't from Willow Creek. Her family had moved there from the city when she was a kid, chasing a quieter life after her dad lost his job. But she'd carved out a place for herself behind the counter, pouring lattes and trading small talk with the regulars. Lynn had a habit of noticing things others missed: the way the light hit the river at dusk, the quiet sadness in a customer's voice, the story behind a stranger's eyes. And Tom, he was a story she couldn't stop wondering about. She'd watch him from the shop, her hands busy steaming milk or wiping down the espresso machine, her gaze drifting past the steamed-up windows to where he sat. Why did nobody ask where he came from? Why did he always clutch that battered wooden box like it was his last tether to the world? One sticky August afternoon, when the cicadas were screaming loud enough to drown out the hum of the air conditioner, she got her answer, or at least the start of one. A pack of teenage boys, all sunburned shoulders and cocky grins, were lounging by the oak, tossing a football back and forth. Tom sat a few feet away, his head bowed, muttering into his lap. One of the boys, Jake, the mayor's kid with a smirk that begged for a slap, spotted him and nudged his buddies. "Hey, check it out," he said, loud enough for the square to hear. "Old Tom wants a snack." He dangled a half-eaten sandwich just out of reach, waving it like a matador taunting a bull. Tom's shake a hand stretched toward it, his fingers brushing air, and the boys erupted in laughter. "That's enough," Lynn muttered, her jaw tightening. She snatched a loaf of day-old bread from the counter, sourdough, a little stale but still good, and slipped out the door before she could second-guess herself. The heat hit her like a wall, thick and humid, but she marched across the square anyway, her sneakers slapping the pavement. "Here," she said, kneeling to press the bread into Tom's hands. His skin was rough, like sandpaper worn smooth at the edges, and his eyes flicked up to meet hers. They were gray, almost translucent, and for a split second she thought she saw something flicker in them. Gratitude, maybe, or a memory stirring awake. But he just nodded, clutching the loaf to his chest like a lifeline. "Get back here, Lynn!" Mr. Henry's voice boomed from the shop doorway, sharp enough to cut through the cicada's drone. Henry Davis was her boss, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a perpetual scowl and a temper that flared like a matchstick. He stood there in a stained apron, arms crossed, his bald head gleaming with sweat. "I told you not to mess with that filthy old man. He's bad for business." "He's hungry," Lynn shot back, brushing her hands on her apron as she stood. "What's it hurt to give him something?" "It hurts my bottom line," Henry snapped, jabbing a finger at her. "Customers don't want to see some bum loitering around stinking up the place next time you're out of a job." His voice carried a finality that made her stomach twist, but she bit her tongue and trudged back inside. The boys scattered, still snickering, and Tom hunched over his bread, tearing off a piece with slow, deliberate bites. Lynn leaned against the counter, her chest tight, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to him than the town wanted to see. The storm rolled in a week later, a gray monster that swept up the river valley and turned Willow Creek into a watercolor smear of mud and rain. It started with a low rumble, the kind that made dogs whine and old folks mutter about their joints, then unleashed itself in sheets that pounded the rooftops and flooded the gutters. The oak's branches sagged under the weight, leaves tearing loose to swirl in the wind, and the square emptied out as folks ducked for cover. Lynn was alone in the shop, closing up early. The last customer, a harried mom with a toddler in tow, had dashed out 20 minutes ago, and Henry had left her to lock up while he ran some errand in his beat-up Ford. She was wiping down the espresso machine, the rag squeaking against the metal, when she glanced out the rain-streaked window and froze. Tom was still out there, slumped against the oak's trunk, his head lolling forward like a puppet with its strings cut. The wooden box he always carried slipped from his arms, hitting the ground with a dull thud that she swore she heard over the storm. She didn't think. Dropping the rag, she grabbed her jacket, a flimsy thing that wouldn't do much against the downpour, and bolted outside. The rain hit her like a slap, soaking her through in seconds, but she didn't care. "Mr. Tom!" she yelled, her voice nearly lost in the wind as she splashed across the square. She dropped to her knees beside him, mud seeping into her jeans. His face was pale, almost gray, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. His hands twitched, reaching for the box, now cracked open in the muck, its contents spilling out. Yellowed papers, a few faded Polaroids, and oddly, a tarnished silver medal that caught the dim light like a beacon. "Hold on," she said, her voice shaking as she pressed a hand to his shoulder. He was cold, too cold, and she fumbled for her phone, cursing the wet screen as she dialed 911. Before she could hit call, a shadow loomed over her. "What the hell's going on out here?" Mr. Henry's voice cut through the storm, sharp and furious. He'd pulled up in his truck, headlights slicing through the rain, and now he stood there with a small crowd gathering behind him. Folks who'd peeked out from shops and porches, umbrellas popping up like mushrooms. "Get that old fool out of here before he scares off my customers." "He's hurt!" Lynn shouted, shielding Tom with her body as the rain plastered her hair to her face. "We need an ambulance." "He's just drunk," a woman in a yellow raincoat sneered, clutching her purse like it might shield her from the sight. "Look at him! Pathetic!" "He's not drunk," Lynn snapped, her voice breaking with frustration. She scooped up the box's contents, papers soggy, photos curling at the edges, and shoved them into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing the metal's cool surface. Henry stormed closer, his boots squelching in the mud, his face red with rage. "Enough of this circus," he growled, waving at Pete, the shop's part-time security guy. Pete was a big, quiet man with a buzz cut and a soft spot for stray dogs. But Henry's glare left no room for hesitation. "Drag him out of here." Pete stepped forward, glancing at Lynn with an apologetic shrug, and grabbed Tom's arm. The old man let out a faint, garbled cry, his fingers clawing at the air, and the crowd murmured, some stepping back, others craning their necks for a better look. Lynn lunged to stop Pete, her sneakers slipping in the mud, but Henry grabbed her shoulder, his grip like iron. "You're done," he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "Pack your things and get out." Before she could argue, he snatched the medal from her pocket, his thick fingers closing around it. "Trash!" he spat, and with a flick of his wrist, he flung it toward the river. The silver glinted once in the air, a fleeting spark, before vanishing into the churning water. The crowd froze as a new voice thundered across the square. "Stop!" Mr. Cole Harrison, the town chairman, shoved through the onlookers, his navy suit drenched and his graying hair plastered to his forehead. He'd been on his way to a council meeting, briefcase swinging at his side, when he'd seen the commotion from his car. Now his eyes locked on the spot where the medal had sunk, and without a word, he leapt into the shallows, splashing through the muddy current like a man possessed. "What the hell's he doing?" someone muttered, a hardware store owner named Bill peering out from under his hood. Cole emerged seconds later, soaked to the bone, clutching the medal in his fist. He held it up, his hands trembling, and turned to the crowd with a look of raw, unfiltered disbelief. "Do you know who this man is?" he roared, pointing at Tom, still slumped against Pete's grip. The square went silent, the rain drumming a relentless beat against the pavement, the only sound left in the world. Cole's voice cracked as he stepped forward, water dripping from his sleeves. "This is Thomas J. Carter. 50 years ago, he pulled my father and half this damn town out of a flood that nearly wiped us off the map. He was a soldier, a hero. That medal, it's the Silver Star of Valor, and we've been treating him like garbage." A gasp rippled through the crowd, sharp and sudden like a crack in glass. Lynn's knees buckled, and she sank into the mud beside Tom, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. His eyes fluttered open, meeting hers, and he managed a weak, crooked smile, half gratitude, half exhaustion. The Polaroids in her pocket pressed against her hip, their edges soggy but intact, and she wondered what else they held. Mr. Henry's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I didn't know," he stammered, stepping back as if the truth might scald him. You didn't ask, Cole shot back, his voice low and cutting. He knelt beside Tom, his suit ruined, and placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. I'm so sorry, Uncle Tom, we failed you. Tom's voice was barely a whisper, rasping through the rain. No blame, just wanted to sit here under my tree. His head tilted back against the trunk, and for a moment he looked almost peaceful, the storm washing away decades of neglect. The ambulance screeched into the square minutes later, its siren slicing through the storm like a knife. Paramedics, two young guys in blue jackets, loaded Tom onto a stretcher, their movements quick but gentle, while the crowd dispersed in a daze. Some hung their heads, muttering apologies to the air. Others lingered, staring at the oak as if it might speak. Lynn climbed into the ambulance with Tom, clutching his hand, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin. Cole followed in his car, barking orders into his phone to rally the town council. By sunrise, Willow Creek was a different place. The storm had passed, leaving a sky streaked with pink and gold, and the square buzzed with a nervous energy. Word spread fast. Tom wasn't just some vagrant. He was a hero, a living legend they'd let rot under their noses. A fundraiser popped up by noon, spearheaded by the local diner owner, Martha, who set up a jar on her counter labeled "For Tom." Kids who'd once thrown rocks now taped crumpled dollar bills to it, their parents watching with sheepish nods. The council met in a flurry, sketching plans for a plaque under the oak. Something simple but permanent. Thomas J. Carter, hero of Willow Creek. Mr. Henry showed up at the hospital that afternoon, a basket of pastries in his arms and a look of defeat on his face. He found Lynn in the waiting room, her hair still damp, sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup. I was wrong, he said, avoiding her gaze as he set the basket on a chair. You've got your job back, and a raise if you'll take it. I shouldn't have, you know. Lynn nodded, too tired to argue. Thanks, she said, her voice flat. Her focus was on Tom, not Henry. He was stable now, tucked into a clean hospital bed on the second floor, his hair combed back and his hands resting steady on the blanket. The nurses had washed the grime from his face, revealing sharp cheekbones and a jaw that hinted at the man he'd once been. She sat with him that evening, the room quiet except for the hum of machines. You didn't have to do all this, he told her, his voice stronger now, rough but clear. I'm nobody special. Somebody had to, she replied, squeezing his hand, and you're wrong. You're more special than this town ever knew. For a while, it felt like the story was over. Tom was safe. The town was waking up, and Lynn could breathe again. But then she noticed something. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the river gold, Tom would stare out the window, his fingers tracing the edges of a crumpled letter he'd kept from the box. It was one of the few things she'd salvaged from the mud. A child scrawl in faded ink, signed, Lily, your little bird. When she asked about it, his eyes clouded over, and his voice dropped to a whisper. My girl, he said, barely audible. Lily lost her in the flood, but lately I dream she's out there looking for me. Lynn's heart skipped. You think she's alive? He shook his head, slow and heavy. Just an old man's foolishness. She's gone, been gone 50 years. The way he said it, the way his fingers lingered on the paper, told her he wasn't so sure. Lynn couldn't let it go. The letter haunted her. Its looping handwriting burned into her mind. She borrowed it from Tom one afternoon, promising to bring it back, and showed it to Cole over coffee at Brew and Bean. The shop was quiet. Henry off somewhere counting inventory, and Cole sat across from her in a booth, his tie loosened and his brow furrowed. "Do you think it's possible," she asked, sliding the letter across the table, "that she survived?" Cole rubbed his chin, his fingers rasping against stubble. That flood was a monster, took dozens of lives, wiped out whole families. If Lily made it, it'd be a miracle. He's old, Lynn. Could be wishful thinking, nothing more. But what if it's not? She pressed, leaning forward. What if she's out there? He sighed, glancing at the letter. "I'll dig into the archives, see what I can find, but don't get your hopes up, and don't get his up either." She nodded, but her mind was already racing. Against Henry's protests, "Don't stir up trouble, girl. We've got enough on our plate." She mailed a copy of the letter to Mike Torres, a local reporter she'd met at a town fair. Mike was a wiry guy in his 30s, always chasing stories about lost dogs or forgotten history, and he had a knack for digging up the past. "Look into this," she wrote in a hasty note. "It's important." Days turned into weeks, and Tom grew quieter, his gaze fixed on the river each night like he was waiting for something or someone. The hospital room became his sanctuary, the oak visible through the window, and Lynn visited daily, bringing him coffee or a newspaper he'd barely glance at. "Don't waste your time," he told her one evening, his voice brittle as dry leaves. "She's gone. I know it. Just let an old man dream in peace." She wanted to argue, but the weight in his eyes stopped her. Then, 3 weeks later, Mike called. She was wiping tables at the shop, the lunch rush just fading, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. "I found someone," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "A woman in the city, Helen Grayson. She was pulled from a flood as a kid, maybe 4 or 5 years old, back in '75. Raised in an orphanage, no clear memory of her folks. But here's the kicker. She's got a bracelet, silver, with a little bird etched on it. Matches one in the photos you sent." Lynn's breath caught. "You're sure?" "Not 100%, Mike admitted, "but it's a hell of a lead. I'm emailing you a picture. Check with Tom." She hung up, her hands trembling, as she opened the email on her phone. There it was, a grainy shot of a silver bracelet, a tiny bird scratched into the metal, identical to the one in a Polaroid from Tom's box. A blurry image of a little girl with pigtails clutching his hand under the oak. She ran to the hospital that night, bursting into his room with the phone clutched tight. "Mr. Tom," she said, breathless, "I think we found her. Lily, she might be alive." He stared at her, his face a mask of stone, then shook his head violently. "Number, no more lies. My Lily's dead. Don't make me hope again, just let me be." His voice broke, and he turned away, curling into himself like a child. Helen Grayson arrived on a crisp fall morning, the kind where the air smells of wood smoke and the leaves glow red against a pale sky. She stepped off the Greyhound bus with a worn suitcase and a nervous smile, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a loose braid. She was 52, her face lined with a quiet strength, and around her wrist dangled the bracelet, a thin silver band with a bird etched deep. Lynn met her at the station, her stomach churning with a mix of hope and dread. "He doesn't want to see you," she admitted as they stood by the ticket booth, the wind tugging at their coats. "He's afraid." Helen nodded, her eyes glistening. I've been afraid too. All I remember is water, rushing, cold, pulling me under, and a man singing to me soft and low. I've carried that song my whole life, never knowing where it came from. I need to know if it was him. They drove to the square in Lynn's rattling old Honda, the oak looming ahead like a sentinel. Tom was there, bundled in a blanket Cole had brought, sitting under the tree for the first time since the hospital. The townsfolk had taken to leaving flowers at its base, a quiet tribute, and a few lingered now, watching from a distance. Helen stepped out, her suitcase thumping against the pavement, and approached slowly, her voice trembling. "Sir, my name's Helen," she said, stopping a few feet away. "I think I might be your Lily." Tom's head snapped up, his face twisting with a pain so raw it stopped Lynn's breath. "You're not her!" he shouted, standing shakily, his blanket slipping to the ground. "My girl's gone. Stop this. Stop tearing me apart." His voice cracked, echoing across the square, and a murmur ran through the onlookers. Lynn stepped forward, her heart pounding, but Helen raised a hand, her eyes locked on Tom. Then softly, she began to sing a lullaby, simple and haunting. The same tune Lynn had heard him mutter in his sleep. "Hush now, little bird, the river's wide and deep. Close your eyes and dream, I'll keep you safe to sleep." Her voice wavered, but it carried, threading through the crisp air like a thread pulling tight. The color drained from Tom's face. His knees buckled, and he sank back to the ground, tears streaming down his cheeks, cutting tracks through the weathered lines. "Lily," he whispered, reaching for her with trembling hands. "My little bird." She knelt beside him, dropping her suitcase, and they clung to each other, sobbing under the oak as the town held its breath. Lynn stood frozen, tears blurring her vision, and Cole appeared at her side, his hand resting heavy on her shoulder. "You did this," he said quietly. "You brought her back." Willow Creek threw a celebration that night, the square alive with light and sound. Lanterns swung from the oak's branches, casting a warm glow over tables piled with potluck dishes. Martha's famous cornbread, Bill's smoked ribs, a dozen pies from the church ladies. A local band strummed guitars and fiddles, the music drifting over the river, and kids darted through the crowd chasing fireflies. Tom and Helen sat together under the tree, a quilt draped over their shoulders, trading stories of the years they'd lost. She told him about the orphanage, the lonely nights, the bracelet she'd never taken off. He told her about the flood, the screams, the moment he'd lost her hand in the current. Lynn watched from the sidelines, a lump in her throat, as Cole unveiled the plaque. "To Thomas J. Carter, hero, father, heart of Willow Creek." The crowd cheered, a ragged, heartfelt sound, and Tom managed a small wave, his arm around Helen. Mr. Henry, quieter now, less bluster in his step, approached Lynn with a rare smile. "You started this," he said, clapping her shoulder. "I'm putting up cash for a program, reuniting families finding the lost. You're running it if you're up for it." She blinked, caught off guard. "Me?" "Who else?" he said, shrugging. "You've got the heart for it. Finish what you started." As the stars came out, sharp and bright against the velvet sky, Tom pulled Lynn aside. He was steadier now, his voice rough but firm. "You gave me my life back," he said, his gray eyes clear for the first time, twice over. She smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. You gave me something too, Mr. Tom. Hope, faith that people can change. He nodded, glancing at Helen, then back at the oak. This tree's seen a lot. Guess it's got one more story now. And under its branches, where it all began, Willow Creek found its soul again. One small act of kindness at a time. The river rolled on, silver and steady, carrying the echoes of a town reborn.